Let me tell you something strange about people who love silence at home. We live in a world that celebrates constant connection, where every quiet moment feels like a void waiting to be filled with noise, notifications, or someone else's voice. Maybe you're one of them, someone who turns down invitations, not because you dislike people, but because you need the walls around you to stop echoing with anything but your own breath. And maybe no one has ever explained to you why that doesn't make you cold, distant, or broken. If you want to understand what you feel without labels and find words to explain yourself without justifying, stay here. This isn't about diagnosing you. This is about translating the quiet into something the loud world can finally understand, or at least stop questioning. Here, we speak the language of relief, not judgment. We turn psychology into permission, not pathology. The world will tell you that loving time alone means something is wrong with you, that choosing silence over socializing is a red flag, a withdrawal symptom, evidence of depression or dysfunction. But you know it's not that simple. You know that sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is close your door and let the world continue without you for a while. Subscribe if you want to understand the parts of yourself the world has always misnamed. Here we don't fix you. We help you find the words to explain what you've always known but could never quite say. This is where silence finally gets to speak. The world calls this antisocial behavior. It labels the need for silence as withdrawal, as if choosing stillness over stimulation were a symptom of something missing inside you. Society has built an entire vocabulary around the idea that wanting to be alone is somehow less than wanting to be together. Introverted becomes a diagnosis. Homebody becomes an excuse. Needing space becomes neediness of a different kind, the kind that makes people uncomfortable because they can't understand it. But what if it's the opposite? What if loving silence at home is actually a profound form of self-awareness? A quiet rebellion against a culture that confuses presence with performance. Consider this. Perhaps it's not about avoiding the world. It's about protecting your inner world from being colonized by everyone else's expectations, moods, and energy. Maybe silence isn't absence at all, but the purest form of presence you know how to give yourself. Think of it as emotional hygiene, as mental clarity, as the cultivation of inner congruence, that rare state where what you feel inside actually matches what you're experiencing outside. It's the space where you stop performing your existence and finally just exist, where you don't have to manage anyone's perception of you or translate your energy into something more palatable for public consumption. The people who understand this don't fear quiet. They fear what happens when there isn't any. They've learned that silence isn't empty. It's full of thoughts that finally have room to form completely, full of feelings that don't have to be explained or justified, full of a version of themselves that only exists when no one else is watching. We live in a culture that rewards the opposite of what you need, where being home alone is seen as loneliness rather than chosen solitude, where silence reads as emptiness instead of fullness. Presence has become performance, and if you're not constantly available, visible, sharing, connecting, you're accused of hiding. The modern world operates on a simple, brutal equation. If you're not seen, you don't exist. If you're not responding, you're ignoring. If you're not engaging, you're withdrawing. But maybe the real noise isn't outside your door. Maybe it's the expectation that you should always be open, always on, always translating your inner life into something consumable for others. Social media taught us that existence requires an audience, that every moment gains value only when witnessed and validated. The dopamine cycle of likes and replies creates a compulsion to turn inward experiences into outward displays. We've gamified human connection and turned presence into a performance metric. You feel this pressure differently than most people. Where others feel energized by constant social stimulation, you feel drained. Where they find meaning in being seen, you find it in the freedom of being unseen. This isn't a failure of personality, it's a different relationship with energy itself. You understand something most people spend their whole lives running from, that you are complete without an audience. The culture of exposure tells you this makes you less, that you're missing out, falling behind, disconnecting from what matters. But you've always known something different. You've known that some things only exist fully when they're protected from other people's eyes. That intimacy with yourself requires the same privacy you'd give to intimacy with another person. That silence isn't the opposite of connection. Sometimes it's the deepest connection available. Psychologists have a term for what you possess, a strong internal locus of control. It means your sense of worth, your validation, your peace. They come from within rather than from external sources. Most people spend their entire lives seeking themselves in mirrors held up by other people. They need someone else to tell them they're okay, they're interesting, they're valuable. They construct their identity from the reflections they see in other people's eyes. But you've developed something rarer, the ability to validate your own existence without external confirmation. This is also about emotional self-regulation, the capacity to know when to open and when to close, when to engage and when to retreat. In simpler terms, it's knowing how to exist without needing to be seen. It's psychological ownership over your own space, your own rhythm, your own silence. You understand that your energy is a finite resource, not an unlimited supply that should be available to anyone who asks for it. You've learned to be a steward of your own inner world. This isn't avoidance, it's discipline. It's the courage to resist the constant pull towards social stimulation and say, I choose what fills my space, and right now I choose nothing but myself. Most people can't do this. They experience silence as something that needs to be filled, a problem that needs solving. They reach for their phones, turn on the television, call a friend, anything to avoid being alone with themselves. But you've learned something they haven't, that the self is not something to escape from, but something to return to. In a world optimized for distraction, your love of silence is an act of resistance. You're not broken because you need quiet. You're awake. You've recognized that the human soul requires space to breathe, to process, to simply be. You've understood that constant stimulation isn't living, it's numbing. And you've chosen something harder, something lonelier, but ultimately something more real, the courage to be still. Of course, it doesn't always come from peace. Sometimes loving silence is also about fear, fear of being misunderstood, of having your energy drained, of letting the world see parts of you that feel too tender or too true. Sometimes it's a defense mechanism you built after too many conversations that left you feeling emptier than before you started them. After too many gatherings where you smiled and nodded and said the right things, then came home and collapsed from the exhaustion of being perceived. Sometimes silence is chosen, sometimes it's learned, and sometimes it's the only safe place left. And that's okay, because even fear is a form of care, even withdrawal can be wisdom. The shadow side doesn't invalidate the light. You can honor both the strength in your solitude and the wound that sometimes makes it necessary. Maybe you learned that people take more than they give. Maybe you discovered that your sensitivity, the very thing that makes you feel so deeply, also makes you vulnerable to being overwhelmed by other people's emotions, needs, and expectations. Maybe you're protecting something precious that the world has tried to take from you before. The quiet isn't always comfortable, but it's always honest. There are days when your love of silence feels like freedom, and days when it feels like exile. Days when you choose it proudly, and days when you wonder if you've chosen it too well, if you've built walls so high that no one can reach you anymore. This ambivalence is part of the truth. You don't have to pretend that solitude is always blissful or that you never feel lonely in your silence. What matters is that you're not running from yourself. You're running toward yourself, and that distinction changes everything. The person who hides in solitude and the person who finds themselves there might look the same from the outside, but the internal experience is completely different. You know the difference. You know when your silence is healing and when it's hardening. And knowing that, being honest about that, is part of what makes your relationship with quiet so mature. Avoiding noise isn't isolation, it's mental hygiene. Speaking less isn't coldness, it's emotional maturity. Staying home isn't giving up, it's coming home to yourself. These distinctions matter because the world has taught you to pathologize your own nature, to see your needs as deficits rather than differences. But what if every time you chose silence, you were actually choosing clarity? What if every time you stayed in, you were actually going deeper? Think about what happens in silence. Your thoughts finally have room to complete themselves. Your feelings get to exist without being performed or explained. The constant static of other people's energy, their moods, their expectations, their need for you to be a certain way, finally fades, and you can hear yourself again. This isn't withdrawal from life, this is return to life, the real life that exists underneath all the social choreography we're taught to call connection. There's a quality of rest that only exists in true solitude. Not the rest of sleep, but the rest of not having to be anything for anyone, not having to manage your face, your tone, your energy, not having to translate your inner experience into something suitable for public consumption. In these moments, you're not performing consciousness. You're simply conscious. You're not demonstrating your existence. You're experiencing it. The window with soft light falling through, the coffee growing cold while you watch the afternoon change color. The book you've read 3 times because it understands something about you that most people don't. These aren't the markers of a small life. They're the substance of an inner life. And maybe that's what the world has forgotten how to value. The unmeasured, unwitnessed moments when a person is simply present to themselves, when existence doesn't require proof or productivity or praise, when being is enough. There was someone who tried to be what everyone expected, who said yes to every invitation, who kept their social calendar full, who posted and shared and stayed visible because that's what you're supposed to do, who believed that the exhaustion they felt after every interaction was just the price of connection, that the emptiness was normal, that everyone felt drained by the very relationships they were told should energize them. They thought something was wrong with them for not enjoying what everyone else seemed to love. Then one day, they stopped. Not dramatically, just gradually. They started saying no without elaborate explanations, started spending weekends alone without apologizing for it, started letting their phones sit unanswered while they read or thought or simply stared out the window at nothing in particular. And something unexpected happened. They didn't feel more lonely. They felt less lonely. Because loneliness isn't about being alone, it's about being disconnected from yourself. And all that socializing had been the real disconnection. Studies show that people with strong preferences for solitude often demonstrate higher levels of emotional regulation and lower levels of social anxiety than those who constantly seek external stimulation. But the most beautiful part isn't the research, it's what happens when theory becomes peace. When you finally stop trying to explain yourself and just live according to your own rhythm. When you realize that your need for silence isn't something to overcome, but something to honor. This person didn't become a hermit. They didn't cut everyone off or swear off human connection. They just learned to choose it on their own terms, in doses that felt nourishing rather than depleting. They learned that you can love people and also need long stretches of time away from them. That caring about someone doesn't mean being constantly available to them. That the deepest connections often happen between people who understand how to leave each other alone. It's not about closing off, it's about choosing when to open. You can love people deeply and still need the door closed between you and them most of the time. You can value connection and also value the space around that connection, the silence that makes the conversation meaningful when it finally happens. This isn't contradiction, it's complexity. It's the maturity to understand that sustainable relationships require boundaries and that protecting your solitude actually makes you more present when you do show up. You can say, "I like being with people, I just need silence before and after." That sentence is self-awareness, not detachment. You can explain, "I'm not avoiding you. I'm managing my energy so I can be genuine when we're together instead of performing through exhaustion." This is the language you've been looking for. Words that honor both your need for connection and your need for space, without making either one wrong. The world will still misunderstand sometimes. There will still be people who take your silence personally, who interpret your closed door as rejection, who can't comprehend that your absence has nothing to do with them. You can't control that. But you can control whether you betray yourself to make them comfortable. You can decide whether you're going to keep explaining and justifying and apologizing for being exactly who you are. What you're practicing is congruence, alignment between your inner truth and your outer life. Most people live in constant misalignment, doing what they think they should do rather than what they actually want to do, performing a version of themselves that pleases others while the real self withers from neglect. You've chosen something harder, the discomfort of being honest about your needs, even when those needs don't fit the cultural template. And that choice, that alignment, it's where real peace lives. Not every absence is emptiness. Sometimes it's where the soul learns to breathe again, where the self remembers its own shape after being molded by too many other hands. Sometimes silence isn't escape, it's the way back to yourself. The long way, the slow way, but the only way that's actually yours. You've learned that the world's definition of a full life, crowded calendar, constant stimulation, endless connection, can feel like the emptiest existence when it's not aligned with who you actually are. Maybe what you love about silence at home isn't really about the silence at all. Maybe it's about sovereignty, about having dominion over your own space, your own time, your own energy. About creating a life where you're not constantly negotiating with other people's expectations or defending your right to exist differently, where you can be strange or still or exactly yourself without translation, where your value isn't measured by your visibility or your availability or your willingness to perform normalcy. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote about the importance of a room of one's own, a space where the soul could unfold without interruption. He understood that creation, whether of art or of self, requires protection from the world's constant demands, that some things only grow in private, that the most important conversations you'll ever have are the ones you have with yourself in silence, when there's no one to impress and nothing to prove. What part of you has the world never understood, but that in silence you learn to respect? What aspect of your nature have you finally stopped apologizing for? If this gave you words to understand what you've always felt, stay here. We speak about what the world never named, but you've always known. This is where your silence finally becomes a language, where your need for space becomes a form of wisdom. Where coming home to an empty, quiet room feels less like loneliness and more like the most honest form of love you know how to practice. Love for the person you are when no one's watching. Not every absence is emptiness. Sometimes silence is the only place left where you can hear yourself think, feel yourself breathe, remember who you were before the world told you who to be. Your love of silence at home isn't a flaw waiting to be fixed. It's a form of self-knowledge that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. It's the courage to need what you need, even when what you need looks like nothing. Maybe you're not hiding from the world. Maybe you're finally finding yourself in it. And maybe that quiet room, that closed door, that evening alone, maybe that's not isolation. Maybe it's integration. Maybe it's where you become whole again after the world has asked you to be 1,000 fragments of yourself. The silence was never empty. It was full of you, and that was always enough.